means friendly reminder for all of us to go on mute so that you're the only one that's going to be kind of spotlighted by the system then, right?
Yep, thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today in this potluck session.
It's a friendly reminder for all of us to go on mute so that you're the only one that's going to be kind of.
Sorry about that. My name is Ariana Dickey. I'm a research fellow in urban sustainability at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be moderating today's session. So in this potluck, join me as we hear from municipal authorities and private sector contributors on how they are working to create low carbon and climate resilient cities in the United States and in Canada. Excuse me. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. There'll be 3 presentations, 20 minutes each, after which we will have a Q&A. So feel free to put your questions into the chat as we go, and I will come back to them and field them to the appropriate presenter during the Q&A period. I'll also take this opportunity to direct you all to the Knowledge Center, where you can continue the conversation and engage more broadly with the conference themes. We're looking to hear from you on your impressions of the conference and the key messages you're gleaning from the sessions. So I'll just pop that into the chat. So without further ado, let's hear from our first presenters. First, we'll hear from Chris Gassman, Michael Blackhurst, Lydia Morin, and Grant Irvin on their Marshall Plan for Middle America. We'll hear learning points and battle scars from work to move the Ohio Valley towards a more sustainable regional economic future through investment in energy infrastructure and cross-sectoral collaboration. A quick intro to our presenters. Chris Gassman is an associate director of the Center for Sustainable Business, a leading business strategy collaboration hub at the University of Pittsburgh, partnering with companies like IBM and Dick's Sporting Goods, as well as thought leaders like Lisa Ross and Paul Pullman. Dr. Michael Blackhurst is a research scientist and a professional engineer at the Center for Social and Urban Research at the University of Pittsburgh. His current research and consulting domains include energy and water efficiency, renewable energy, regional climate mitigation and adaptation, regional water resource planning, and urban stormwater management. Lydia Morin, as the Congress of Neighboring Communities Executive Director, has led rapid growth, fundraising, and impact of the hybrid policy Think and Do tank and local government membership network in the region of the country with the most local governments per capita. Finally, Grant Irvin serves as the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning for the City of Pittsburgh. Grant oversees the integration of sustainability and resilience into city services, programs, and policy, working to make the City of Pittsburgh a smart, sustainable, and resilient city by fostering partnerships, leveraging assets, and finding creative ways to solve problems. Over to you.
Perfect. Here, Ariana. So my role in this conversation is just to be the mini moderator for our little 20-minute part of the breakout of the popcorn. And as part of the center, very excited to continue the organizing work that the Center for Sustainable Business has done on this front. I'm going to own a bit of imposter syndrome because everyone else on this panel with me has done all of the work. And as the newbie to the center, I came in after everything was from the roadmap was said and done. So we're going to hear from them and less from me. With that, I'd love to hand it over, Mike, to you to talk a little bit more about the roadmap and maybe frame a bit of the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to share my screen and give everyone a quick overview of what's in the Marshall Plan. So everybody's seeing the PowerPoint? All right. And so our session will mostly focus on having a mini Q&A, as Chris indicated. I'm trying to get into full screen mode, but for some reason it won't let me.
Actually, sir, you can.
Yes.
It's the button next to the minus sign.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So I want to acknowledge those who contributed to the Marshall Plan for Middle America report. It was a diverse group of sectors that contributed to the report. Leslie Marshall is no longer with the University of Pittsburgh, was the lead author. I want to thank the NFL Nation for being a sponsor of the report. One of our other speakers today, Grant Urban, was a co-author. And then Thomas Croft and Robin Pollan were also helpful contributors on the report. And I want to build a little bit of intuition for and motivation for the report. Those of you who are familiar with the US history will recognize that much of Middle America has an over-reliance on fossil fuels in terms of their historical investments in energy sectors. And global energy markets shifting towards renewables invite both risks and opportunities for some of these communities. And the Marshall Plan takes a really intentional and regional coordinated strategy to hopefully transform these affected economies and position them for sustained growth. The report also recognizes that many of the communities in the Marshall Plan for Middle America are endowed with high-skilled labor, and that really facilitates this opportunity for sector transformation. The Marshall Plan really focuses on 4 states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And just some very high-level numbers from the report. The report envisions a 50% reduction in fossil-based emissions by 2030, and that would happen as a result of $15 billion annually invested in energy efficiency and $45 billion annually invested in renewables. The results of those investments would significantly reduce energy bills by 40%, create about 410,000 jobs annually, and reduce unemployment by about 2 to 2.5%. The report identifies some potential federal support and private sector investment that can facilitate this regional economic transformation. It also outlines how stakeholders across the region can coordinate, focus on the private sector, our universities, community organizations, governments, local and state governments, federal governments, and investors. And the report provides guidance for ensuring that these transitions provide dignified work and pathways to economic mobility. And we work on empowering and engaging local labor unions. We recognize that labor hasn't been shared across many groups, and the report provides some best practices for addressing those historic inequities. And the report also provides best practices for engaging communities. If you're interested in learning more about the report, I provided a link here. I dropped in the chat, and with that, I'll let Chris facilitate our discussion.
Great, thank you, Mike. So moving over, Lydia, to you, would love from your experience, a little bit more about the what and the how of engaging multiple communities. And Mike, if you could stop sharing screen so we can get back to the group. I don't know if I can do that for my side. There we go. Yeah. Awesome, thank you. All right, Lydia, over to you.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody who's here. I guess the quickest way to talk about the Congress and neighboring communities is just as Ariana introduced, we've got 130 municipalities within our county, and 35 of them share a direct border with the city of Pittsburgh. Meanwhile, the city of Pittsburgh has Grant Urban, who I think you all can't wait for him to speak because he's going to tell you what he's managed to do so far. But what I've been doing with Connect is really talking about what is possible and why we would need to do it. And having these different sized communities all share a border with the city with different levels of capacity creates kind of a challenge when you want to go for a major behavior change or major investment strategy change, just general thought change. And so what we do is we really work on relationships and trust with each other, with the city and between each municipality, so that, if someone's done it before, you can trust that they've done a really good job and that's something that you can learn from. And so when the city and the Center for Sustainable Business published the Marshall Plan for Middle America, it was happening around the same time that Connect was starting a climate action plan. We had about 5 communities do it on their own. And these climate action plans are passed by their councils. And it's about, first of all, inventorying greenhouse gases, understanding what the situation is. And, before you act, you have to understand. And then it was about, You know what doesn't care about a geographical or political border? You know, air pollution, water, all these things. And that was what Connect was set up to do. We know there's all these issues that one municipality can't solve by itself. And what was interesting that we had just learned by inventorying the greenhouse gas emissions from about 37 different governments that directly share a border that surround Pittsburgh, they are actually emitting more than Pittsburgh does on its own. And so Pittsburgh can do everything it wants to do and try really hard, but they are surrounded by 35 other governments who aren't doing that. And so that's why these climate change efforts really have to be regional, and you can't do it alone. You have to do it together. And so that's what Connect does. And that's why Connect was so excited about the Marshall Plan, because it's bigger than about just the 35 governments here. It's multi-state. And so I think it's really about those relationships and trust and having a shared goal. And sometimes that goal isn't everyone's goal yet. And so what we do in Connect is we bring people together. We show them these really cool new investment ideas, what could happen in their community. We work with lots of different sort of pro bono, either, policy development, legal, or even planners who can show beautiful pictures of what could happen in a town that hasn't imagined this quite yet. Maybe it floods all the time. Maybe it has really bad air quality because it's like a triple threat with a valley and a highway, and it's next to a major power plant. And they've never thought this was possible. And so that's what Connect kind of does. And we're very excited for the Marshall Plan.
Awesome. Thank you, Lydia. Much appreciated. So with that kind of framing from the multi, given experience from the one, so Grant, pivot over to you for the what and the how, from engaging on the city perspective.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody. One of the things that we realized, and just a little bit about some of the genesis of the Marshall Plan concept. It's a phrase that often gets tossed around whenever somebody wants to do something big. We need a Marshall Plan. And, the concept really germinated as we, as the city of Pittsburgh, were working with other partner cities across the Ohio River Valley and Upper Appalachia, and realizing we were running into a lot of the same challenges, whether that's with state policy or adoption of new technologies like vehicle electrification or accessing renewable energy markets, and all the things that we were trying to do to hit our climate targets, and realize that there is a macro architecture above us that we needed to be able to alter in order to make those changes on the ground like Lydia is describing. And so we looked to the Center for Sustainable Business and the team that the University of Pittsburgh put together with Mike's leadership and others to help paint that picture of what a renewable energy transition could look like in the heart of coal country. And a little bit of context for the audience is that oil was discovered about 60 miles northeast of the city of Pittsburgh in a small little place called Titusville, Pennsylvania, in the Drake oil well. So if you ever want to kind of Google that, you can understand that that's where oil came from. And actually oil was floated down the Allegheny River to the city of Pittsburgh in big slicks where it was refined. And so it actually kind of led to the advent of my department, the planning department, which created the Fos zoning ordinance over top of the refinery on 7th Avenue. But that's a deep part of our history in order not understanding how do we organize across the region led us to the need to create and paint that picture of the Marshall Plan event. And it came under, I think, two fundamental understandings. One is that we are stronger as a region by working together. And so whether that's Dayton, Ohio, or Columbus, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, joining together around federal advocacy or even just knowledge and practice sharing, that can help us move the market. The second issue is that we're dealing with three layers of the equity conversation. And that's at the individual level, it's at the rural and urban level, and it's also at the mega regional level. So when we think about kind of the way that resources have been applied to coastal communities in the United States or mega cities and mega regions where capital has traditionally flowed to, that has ultimately harmed the Ohio River Valley at the expense of our people. And so by working together with both big cities and small communities together, that gives us an opportunity to play much bigger than what we are individually. Final point that I'll make is is just to lead into kind of the work that Lydia has talked about, is that we've recognized that cities can't do it alone, and that we have to act as both sub-regions, so southwestern Pennsylvania, but also across the region of the Ohio Valley, in order to think about some of the systemic changes that we need to make, hence the advent of the Marshall Plan.
Thank you, Grant. So building a bit on that, this is where the kind of popcorning across everyone comes in and gets to be fun. Would love, building on that last piece, one thing that we often talk about or has come up in conversation has been making sure that folks are at the table, right, to engage those. And so I love, from the panel's experience, one thing that we've talked about is, what did we do well, and what was a scar that, like, hey, wish we could do this better, or learn from us so that others can do better, as far as engaging and reaching out to those often not reached or often not engaged.
I'll hop in real quick. One of the things, we recently hosted an event with many of you here on the call, but a broader partnership that pulled together a 4-day seminar on how do we move this strategy forward. And one of the big lessons around that conversation was you need to bring labor to the table early. And so our engagement with organized labor, and we did it, very intentionally around this event, including having Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh at that event. It allowed us to bring a whole host of insights in terms of training, workforce development, renewable project development, and understanding the needs of having our brothers and sisters from the organized labor movement there at the very early stages, because what it does is ultimately help to better shape policy as well as project development.
Perfect. Thanks, Grant. Lydia, anything from your side? You are literally of an organization of integration by nature. Any lessons learned, battle scars from trying to reach those are often not reached?
So I think that is the great way to put it. There's a lot of folks who aren't reached, and they're literally right across a bridge from where a lot of folks are. And so what we are trying to do is build those bridges. I think what I also took away was just how, yes, we want to invest in these big projects and they're very cool, but if we don't invest in having folks understand why they really want to advocate for these projects in their own turf, or, support their neighbor having this project, I feel like, as important as labor is, it's important to engage just a lot of the folks that are making decisions, as like these council members and mayors of towns that do not have a background in sustainability or investment or capital. They might be an awesome school teacher who decided to run for office, and that is the person who is, responsible for making a lot of big asks and changes in places. And so Connect likes to try to help them. And I think I'm realizing that we're going to have to do a lot of big asks around having enough humans to be able to have one-on-one conversations with this myriad of leaders in our region. Those like just even 15 minutes, it takes a minute to happen. And you got to have a skilled person who's been trained to speak to somebody. And I think that's something that we kind of underestimate when we start to build out these ideas, that community engagement angle.
So not just somebody, you can send a young person out into the field and they can engage.
Exactly.
There's a bit more to it than that. Perfect. So Mike, to bring you into the conversation and to double up on it, kind of tee up the next question. One, would love your thoughts on reaching those often not reached, and then also academia has often led the charge. A lot of the research that started in academia around the transition to a cleaner economy started within the hallowed halls of research and then percolated out into R&D and development and is now out there in the market. What role do you see for academia in this, right? As far as what role should we be playing? Where could we be helpful? What have we not tapped into, or where might be an opportunity, or any other battle scars, lessons learned from the Marshall Plan experience so far?
Sure. Yeah, I think academics can play a couple of key roles. One is we don't have a good land or a model yet for making infrastructure investments that are equitable. And engineers and infrastructure planners tend to make investments on a least cost or most cost effective basis, and we don't think about the distributional impacts of that investment. So I think there's an opportunity to work across disciplines to ensure more equitable outcomes from our infrastructure investments. I think it was interesting hearing somebody from Cincinnati, I forget his name, Grant, you can interfere if you remember him talking about this, was talking about how it was challenging for him to demonstrate the benefits of their energy efficiency investments. And we don't do a great job of measuring and verifying how our investments affect people and how we achieve our goals. And so I think academics can really do a good job of institutionalizing measurement and verification to track our outcomes from these investments. And I think we still need to be very intentional about ensuring that any investments we were to make are not just in individual projects, but are synergistic with respect to transforming the economy. And so I do think that academics can play an important role in ensuring that we're investing in these regions in a way that doesn't just support individual projects, but aggregates up to transformation.
So both, the individual professions changing how and helping rethink about the individual professions and the training there, thinking about, hey, how do we look at projects, and then thinking about how do projects fit together as part of a bigger comprehensive piece.
Oh yeah, we wouldn't want to spend, the $1.2 billion over 10 years and only have that lead to short-term gains in projects. We want to invest that money and look back on it and say, we all of a sudden have a whole new sector of manufacturing solar panels, whatever the outcome is, right? We want to make sure that it's a sustained investment. We invest in capital that can continue to sustain the economies and not just create one-off projects. And that's going to require a lot of intention and a lot of regional coordination.
Perfect. And Lady and Grant, if you all have thoughts as well as far as like the role or opportunity for academia, being mindful of time, the kind of pony up question that I'd also throw to each of you is thinking about, as far as these changes we've been talking about, have they been more on conversations around tech changes that we need to figure out how to make happen, or have they been more around human behavior changes that we need to figure out to make happen? Because we often focus on one and not the other, but we rarely get to do both at the same time. So I'm curious from your on the ground Road Scar experience, which you've seen more of.
Yeah, I mean, the Marshall Plan is a really good example, just to talk to the impact of academia. I mean, so this is, the report is really an example of how we had a lot of disparate ideas as cities in terms of, what we want to see happen. And the research team was able to not only help us translate that and put it on paper, but also put facts, figures, and cool charts and graphs and maps around it. And so that's really important in terms of helping to convey the message and the vision in terms of what we were trying to do, on the local government side and as mayor's offices, right? So that's one. Two, I think it's a little bit of both with regards to the human behavior change as well as the technological change. And so that factors into both, physical infrastructure as well as household decisions. And this is like something that Mike and I talk frequently about in terms of, electrification is a major component of what we are talking about with regards to the need for a clean energy transition. But we've struggled in our own household with making some of those choices with our spouses. And so, that's like the reality in terms of when we're talking about making that transition. These decisions are very discrete points in time that make lasting changes over decades in some cases, in terms of whether we're trying to, install an electric furnace instead of a gas boiler. And so those are like the real world decisions. It's also, I think, in terms of like the technical training and workforce, is making sure that architects, engineers, home builders, developers are also thinking and recognizing that every decision that we make to build a new building or to pave a new road has implications with regards to the climate challenge.
Grant, you want to chime in?
Sure, I'll just kind of build on that idea that it's absolutely both a human behavior change and a technology change. And for a lot of the municipalities that aren't necessarily the metropolitan city, a great example of that is Connect worked on a software called Coordinate PA. In Western Pennsylvania, or all of Pennsylvania, when you had a project that you were going to dig, a utility project, a road project, anything like that, all you had to do was call a phone number 3 days in advance and say, hey, I'm going to dig. And they'd be like, all right, great. You done what the law says. What our member communities wanted was, hey, maybe if we could plan with the gas company, we wouldn't pay to pave this road, and then it would get dug up and we had to buy all these materials again and waste 1 year later and then the gas company also doesn't want to pave the road twice. And so, and I had to mention, Connect is actually based at the University of Pittsburgh as well. So we had access to students and computer scientists. Said, this is not that hard to build. We don't know why this doesn't exist. It's 2015. And so we started to build the software. And then, the PA1 call, 811 said, okay, if you guys want to do this, we want to roll this out across the whole state. But and now we've done that. So anyway, Connect led the way. We've got this beautiful shared software where people can plan projects with the utilities in advance. But so the technology is there now, but now we've got all these, municipal secretaries who have gotten into that behavior of I make a phone call and I'm done, right? Now they have to get onto a computer, log things, and that's a huge behavior change just right there. And so now Connect says we'd really like to inventory our greenhouse gases regularly so that we know we can start to do what Mike said, have that story to tell. We can see our progress. We know what the problem is, but it's a very labor intensive process and it requires a lot of specific behaviors. And so now our job as Connect and, what we have to ask for is how do we make this the easiest way? Like, how do we maximize that technology to make it easiest for humans to change their behavior? So I think it is absolutely the same, but anyway, agree.
Awesome. Well, being mindful of time, I believe that we've touched on a lot of what the Innovate for Cities has been calling for, of recapping a bit of like what is the research that has happened over the last 2 years, teeing up what research would be helpful, and obviously demonstrating the value of integration from a lot of different sides and moving the needle forward. So with that, hand it back over to you for the next popcorn.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. For me, more than anything, what really shone through was the importance of collaboration across all 4 of your comments. So looking forward to exploring that more in the Q&A section. So in our next presentation, we'll hear from Julius Lindsay about the Richmond Hill Climate Change Conversation Toolkit and how the City of Richmond Hill used an innovative co-creation process to connect city climate and greenhouse gas data to residents to equip them to take climate action themselves. A bit about Julius. Julius is currently the Director of Sustainable Communities and the David Suzuki Foundation. Most recently, he was a project manager of climate change and sustainable development for the City of Richmond Hill, leading to the city's climate change mandate, which includes developing a corporate climate change framework and a community, energy, and emissions plan. So over to you, Julius.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to take it down a little bit more to the citizen level and talk about some of the work that we did with our citizens in Richmond Hill, leading to the development of the climate change toolkit. So in terms of Richmond Hill, let me go back. In terms of Richmond Hill, for those who are not familiar with the city, it's in Ontario and in Canada. It's just north of the city of Toronto. Our population, we have about 200,000 people and we're about 101 square miles. And as you can see by some of the stats there, the city is quite diverse. It's also quite upper class. Like our average household income is over $100,000. We're quite well educated. 50% of the city has a bachelor's degree of above, and there's a 65% employment rate. So in terms of the city of Richmond Hill, We had a climate change mandate that was passed by our council in 2018, and that consisted of really two major pieces. The first is a corporate climate change framework, which is an umbrella guiding document that is going to outline how the city's climate change program for the corporation of the city of Richmond Hill. And then we also had a community energy and emissions plan, which is a community plan for the whole geographic region of the city of Richmond Hill to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and explore related economic opportunities. So in terms of our community energy emissions plan, it was passed by council back in May. And we have a target to be net zero GHG emissions by 2050. Net zero for us signifies that by the year 2050, Richmond Hill will have reduced its GHG emissions as much as possible, and will not be emitting more than it's offsetting. So in terms of that, the city's low carbon transition, it looks like this graph. So right now we emit about 1.1 million tons of CO2 a year. And that is sort of pretty much meant to stay steady. It's going to increase a little bit by the year 2050. And if we want to get to net zero, then we are looking at a transition down to about 130 kilotons or 130,000 tons per year, which is about a 7% carbon gap, which means that we have 7% that will make up by technologies that haven't emerged yet or by offsetting. You can see on the right how we're going to do that. So 40% is through transformation of our transportation system, 30% is sufficient buildings, and then we have another of other areas, including smart energy, compact communities, natural heritage, zero waste, and then 2% is our municipal leadership. So that's how the city itself is going to get to net zero. In terms of the actions, and don't bother reading this whole slide, but you can see that our actions split up into those 7 program areas, and under those 7 program areas, we have a number of sub-targets. So basically defines, if we're going to get to net zero, like what does that actually mean on the ground? Things like, we want to have a 65% active transportation modes share, 100% methane recovery, electric municipal fleet, things like that. And then under these subcategories, we have 45 actions that are sort of lay out what the city is going to do from a climate change perspective. In addition, we've done some work with our region. So the way our municipality works is that we are a lower tier and we have an upper tier region government. We've done some work with all the municipalities in our region, and to look at what is the future going to look like in Richmond Hill in terms of climate. So we define it as warmer, wetter, and wilder. So you can see some of the stats here: a 3.3 degree increase Celsius in temperature, a 216% increase in extreme heat days, 30 more days of growing season. So that means like no frost. Weather, 59 more millimeters of rainfall, average increase, 25% millimeters of more precipitation, rain or snow in the wintertime, depending on where that temperature is. And then wilder, a 300% increase in 40 degrees Celsius. Right now, we average about one day, not even a day per year of 40 degrees Celsius, and that's going to go up to, I think, about 10 days or something like that. So, it's a large increase in 40-degree days and 33% increase in the intensity of extreme storms. So this is all the data of sort of where we go if we do nothing in terms of the next 50 to 100 years. So we took that information and we did as part of our framework, we did a risk assessment. So what is the risks to the city from a climate change perspective? And you can see it breaks down in terms of the climate conditions, the data that we saw above: more intense rainfall, more heat waves, more ice storms, more freeze thaws, and higher wind speeds. That has impacts on the municipality in terms of flooding, heat stress, dangerous road conditions, tree and power line damage, potholes, damage to pipes, power outages, roof damage, and tree damage. And that leads into the consequences from that for the city, the corporation, including business continuity disruption, infrastructure damage, staffing constraints, health and safety risks to public and staff, and increased financial costs from repairs and lost revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So the theme of the rest of my presentation is going to be trust the process, and you're going to see we kind of took a leap of faith with the work that we did, and we had to, and I think there were multiple people in this process who had to trust the process. So like keep that sort of phrase in mind as I go through the rest of my presentation. So in terms of our community, we have a very, very engaged community in Richmond Hill. We started out with 4, and we have now 5 different climate change environment groups in Richmond Hill, all very enthusiastic, all very active. However, all of those groups have a very high connection, like, so they all know each other and they all kind of know who the players are, but there was low collaboration and coordination among those groups. So we went into, when I got to the city 3 years ago and started this project, but we also had a number of requests from those groups for information from the city to support the work that they're doing and to better understand, like, what does climate change mean in Richmond Hill. So we landed on an innovative approach, and really we wanted to combine that grassroots organizing, the research, and information. This is something that's done a lot in the social impact industry and in the social space, but it was directly translatable to climate action. And I saw a great presentation from a lady called Jessica Bellamy. She's currently working with the Root Cause Research organization in I think it's Louisville. That's where they are. And I saw her, she came to Toronto and presented on the work that she was doing in connecting data to citizens to take action on the various social issues that they have in the city. And I thought, like, this is directly translatable to climate and what we're trying to do, and the challenge that we have in our community around providing our citizens with data. So really the toolkit, what we wanted to do was we wanted to go in and create a product that was going to help citizens take action and educate on climate change and what they can do. We wanted to put that power into the citizens' hands so they determine the content and the best form of the final product. So, going in, when we started the process, and I'll talk about the process in a second, a lot of people were like, what are we creating here? And it's like, you're going to tell us what we're creating, because we didn't want to go in and tell people, like, we're going to create a video, or we're going to create a product, or whatever the case is. We want our citizens to tell us what the best product they needed to use. We wanted to be able to translate and transcribe that local data into a usable form. And we wanted to be able to create visualizations that could display the data in a useful way. And part of that was that we were creating our community energy and emissions plan. And we wanted to be able to inform, like, once we have all this data we've generated from the plan, like, how are we going to translate that to the citizens on the ground in our city? So we released it in May alongside our community energy and emissions plan. We used the co-creation process that I talked about earlier, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what that process is in a second. And we used a design consultant, so not an expert on climate change, but an expert on co-creation and design. And the group that we worked with, it had participants. We had students, both high school students and university students. We had private citizens. We had members of our board of trade. We had those community groups that we talked about that we wanted to, provide information from and help, get the word out. And we had a very diverse group. We had some people who English wasn't their first language. As I said, we had some youth. We had about 4 or 5 youth in the group. So we had a very sort of cross section of our city. I mean, we could have did more to get a more representative sample, but we were very happy with the diversity of the group and the diversity of voices around the table that was going to undertake that process. So here's the process as we scoped it. And when I went to my boss the first time to pitch this project to her, she was like, what is the process that we're going to take? Like, what are the logical deductive steps that we're going to take to undertake this process? And I kind of laughed, because I was like, well, part of the process is, like, we kind of let the process take its course, because we're letting the citizens determine what it is and how it's going to work. So it's not going to, like, be incredibly scoped. And she still pushed me to give her something about how that process was going to work. And this is what we scoped out in the beginning. So it was going to be 4 workshops. The first one was just getting to know each other, getting to know the data, and understanding and debriefing on, like, the key points and content. The second was doing a creative briefing. So a creative briefing is really a document that says, okay, what is the information we want? Who's our target audience? What's the message we're trying to send? How are we trying to send that? And we were going to do some brainstorming around the strategy of, like, what the product was actually going to be. The third workshop was going to be really around a presentation back to the city on the initial thoughts from that first session, from the second session, and some ground truthing. And then we're going to refine the strategy from there and then start doing some visual research and some art direction in terms of like what was the product actually going to look like. Then we were going to have a break to do some production, and we were going to come back and have a draft and review that feedback with the group. So that was our scoped process and what I presented to my boss when we first started this project. But this is what the process actually looks like. So, as I said, in that first session, we spent most of the time just sort of getting the ground underneath us. Because as I said, we had a number of people in the group who were like, so what are we actually creating? And it was like, well, you're going to answer that question. We're not going to tell you what we're creating. You're going to tell us what we're creating. And that was very disorienting for especially some of the older folks who worked in the workplace for a while. And like in the workplaces, we constantly think about our final goal and then work towards it, as opposed to thinking about what we want to say and then let that shape what the final goal would be. So it was a bit disorienting for some people in the group. The second session, we spent all of it on that creative briefing to sort of discuss who are we talking to, what are we trying to say, what level of detail do we want, and that process again, working through like what are we actually creating here, and like dealing with that part of the process. The third session was really around that creative briefing. Again, we came back to it and spent more time on it because we had to work through that idea. And once people kind of got their feet under themselves, they were able to better engage in that process. And then during our break, because we did this sort of started in November and then went through the Christmas break and finished it off in the spring. We did some brainstorming and some content generation sort of virtually with the groups using tools like Pinterest and Google Docs to allow people to input all remotely from all the places that they were participating. And, we did some content generation. So once our participants told us what they wanted to see, we started translating that data into a form that they wanted to see, and they were able to give feedback on the tone and the content and like what was missing, all that kind of stuff. So it was like an iterative process. And then our last workshop, we reviewed just the draft text and got some feedback on that. And we got some input on look and feel. And then we had to go back and do some more production and finalization and some input from the group. So as you can see, like this process has to be somewhat flexible because you never know who's going to be in the group, what their level of comfort with the process is. As I said in the beginning, sort of trust the process in terms of what that might look like. So the final product was a conversation guide around, and it was literally called a guide to talking to people in your life about climate change. This is unique because we use very specific Richmond Hill details. So all the information there was not about, ice caps melting in the north or, Pacific islands being drowned by sea rise. This was all about impacts and information and data specific to Richmond Hill. So if somebody using this in Richmond Hill would be able to use this to talk about what's going on in their community, but there is a lot of that information that translates, across Ontario and across Canada in terms of our government systems and things like that. So in terms of how the toolkit's structured, we started out with an introduction. We had some information about climate chat. So this is resources on how to have the conversation. So, what are the entry points? What kind of tone can you use? When you're, and the toolkit was really scoped to talking to people in your life about climate change. So it was like, how do you have that conversation with your brother and your aunt and your friend and some information and tools for people who might be uncomfortable with the conversation. Third, there's a glossary of terms because there's many climate change terms that us climate change wonks might understand, but others won't. This fourth section is about our actions matter. So this was information on individual actions. So what are the things that you can do in your day-to-day life to reduce your impact on climate change? The fifth is connecting community. So this is like actions at the community level. If we looked at things like, heat island effect and other sort of active transportation, other things that are at the community scale. So how can you engage in your community and what kind of actions can be taken at the community level? And then, what kind of actions can you take that can impact your community, not just your footprint and like your home footprint? And then the sixth section is around deepening change. So that's information on engaging various levels of government because, knowledge, and especially in our community where we have a lot of newcomers to our community, immigrants, recent recent immigrants to Canada. We wanted information on how do you engage city government? How do you engage the provincial government? How do you engage the federal government? What are the different pieces of climate change that fall at those different levels? Because many people just, they think government and it's all one big amorphous entity that is kind of ominous, and they don't really understand how to engage it and how to make real change. So a lot of that information in that section was around engaging with the various levels of government. How can you do that? What kind of information how can we make that comfortable? And then the last section was really around resources. So what are the resources if you want more information, you want to learn about a specific topic? We also had like information about those community groups, like you want to get involved, you want to participate with a group in the community. Here are the community groups that are participating in the community. We tried to have a bunch of information there for people who wanted more information. And sort of this is my last slide. I'm can be very quick, but the International Association of Public Participation, IAPP2, I'm not sure how sort of prevalent this organization is outside of Canada, but we use it a lot in Canada and especially at the municipal level when we think about how we take action on climate change, or how we engage the public and engage those in our community around issues. And, typically we end up in the inform, consult, and possibly the involve section of we go out to the public, we consult them, and we use that information to inform what we wanted to do. But in this project, we really wanted to end up on the end of the scale in terms of empower and let the citizens make the decision about what this was going to be, what kind of information could be in it. And, we were really happy with the final product that we got. It was endorsed in council by our council alongside our plan. And, we're really encouraging our community members to engage and to use the product and let us know, how it helps them in terms of taking action. And that's it for me. I no longer work for the city. I now work for the David Suzuki Foundation here in Canada, but up until 3 weeks ago, I was working for the city. So this conference kind of came at this section, but I also have some information here about my colleagues who are still there if there's more information wanted, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn if there's specific questions you have for me, and we're going to have questions later so I can answer any questions there. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Julius, for that comprehensive view of Richmond Hill's co-creation process to produce the conversation toolkit. It really struck me that point in your presentation about the confusion from the community around them leading the process, and how that might speak to how planning has historically kind of played out with directives from the city determining community action, whereas in this case, you're really seeking a community-led output that takes a pragmatic approach to climate change around, how do you socialize climate action? So moving on to our last one, we'll hear from Matthew Claudel and Diane Artal, co-founders of Good Energy. They'll tell us a little bit more about Good Energy and how it supports neighborhood groups as they set up a legal entity that finances, builds, owns, and manages solar microgrids. So a bit about our speakers. Matthew is a designer and a writer. He's the founder of Field States, a benefit corporation whose mission is to generate civic value using strategic design. Most recently, he launched Good Energy, a spin-out that makes community-oriented solar microgrids accessible through alternative ownership and financing models. He's an affiliate faculty member of Portland State University's Department of Geography and holds a doctorate in advanced urbanism from MIT, where his work focused on the emerging practices of urban experimentation as they relate to civic value. Diane Artal-Berger is an attorney with over 15 years of international experience at law firms and in-house legal departments. She's the founder of Altitude Law Firm, advising private and publicly traded US and European companies specializing in energy engineering services, manufacturing, clean technology, renewable energy, software retail, and consumer products. Prior to founding her own law firm, Diane worked for 6 years at Sequoia Corporation. There, she assumed the roles of senior counsel for Chromalloy Gas Turbine and its affiliates worldwide, and deputy general counsel and corporate secretary for Precoat Metals Corporation. So over to you, Matthew and Diane.
Great. I am gonna go ahead and share my screen if that works. Okay. Is that working? Diane, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see.
All right, great. So thank you for having us here. And I'm really excited to be following such great presentations, especially ones that are looking at such a high level at climate change across regions and how we can take concerted action, and then really getting down to the individual level and the individual conversation. And so what we're doing with Good Energy is somewhere in between. What we're trying to do is really change the way a clean energy transition is happening, and to be doing that on a micro level, at the level of human behavior change and household decisions. And I think that we're all here because we have this belief. We have this belief that we can imagine generative, not extractive systems, and that we can really make this climate action change and create new systems of social and economic vitality, in addition to climate vitality. And in order to do that, I think we need new approaches to civic infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I mean both the hard physical infrastructure of our cities and also the organizational systems for governing, for finance, for decision-making, and for behavior. Now, we all agree on this. That's why we're here. But if we're really serious about climate change, we have to develop new models for doing it. We need to really build the thing, an actionable model that we're creating that's called Good Energy. So first things first, I just want to acknowledge what we're reinventing. It's important to define those systems that we're trying to rethink. The conventional model for civic infrastructure was something like this. This is a conceptual diagram of the 20th century orthodoxy. This was all about centralized control and massive scale. And this is basically the way that government and supply chains, physical hard infrastructures, businesses even, have been organized throughout the 20th century. To be blunt, it was a really effective model. These centralized systems work really well, and they're especially good at consuming resources and turning them into consolidated wealth. To Lydia's point earlier, this was a technology that encouraged behavior change. It was really appealing. And it was so appealing that it was applied to all sorts of sectors and domains, things like food production and waste processing and mobility systems. We've been thinking a lot about energy, and that's a good example of these kinds of centralized systems.
And so electricity typically is produced in giant plants that burn coal and oil. It gets stepped up to high voltage, transmitted hundreds of miles, and then stepped down to low voltage near your home. It's a classical example of centralized control and massive scale. But the model is no longer working well. Primarily, it's dirty power. The energy is lost at each conversion from high to low voltage. High voltage transmission lines are a leading cause of fire forest. The system always overproduces because it doesn't know what the demand is going to be. It gets stressed every single time that there is a peak demand. And the whole system goes down during raw weather. And to finish, low-income areas are the last to be fixed when there is an issue. So these issues are not abstract at all. And just to give you an example, PG&E, which is the main power utility in California, is a failing system. The cost of kilowatts per hour has increased by an average of 7% per year since 2009. And the company still went bankrupt in 2019. Brownouts are frequent, and severe weather will only make them worse.
So going back to this diagram, when you have a massive centralized system, and especially one that's more and more vulnerable to failure, that middle dot can fail, and that leaves all these little dots, these individual homes, stranded. So this is the challenge we're facing, and we saw some statistics earlier about Ontario and how that climate change is going to be accelerating. This is going to happen more and more often. But you might be thinking to yourself, what if these individual houses that are stranded, what if they have solar panels? So what if each one of these little dots becomes an independent production and consumption unit? So this is a new conceptual model. It's an atomized conceptual model, as opposed to a centralized and massively scaled one. So production and consumption, in practice, that means solar technology. And in recent years, rooftop solar has improved. It's becoming more and more mainstream. Photovoltaics are cheaper, they're more efficient, the batteries are safer, and they can provide backup for a couple of days. So in practice, what that means is that wealthy people can put solar panels on their roofs and charge their Teslas with renewable energy. And they can make it through a couple of days if there's a power outage, and it's all clean, kind of sun-powered energy, which is absolutely appealing. That's a good thing. And there's a lot of federal subsidies and investments that are going into supporting residential rooftop solar. But we don't think that this is a solution to the problem. Photovoltaic systems are extremely expensive, and the most expensive part is the battery. If you choose to have a system without a battery, it can't operate if there's a main grid failure, power outage. There's also this issue of misalignment between energy production and consumption. So in simple terms, you're not always producing power when you need to consume it. Times like cloudy winter days or nighttime, which is usually when you need a lot of power. And finally, rooftop solar can really only happen on single family homes, effectively wealthier people. And that's because it's really difficult to manage a common rooftop solar array on a larger multifamily building. There aren't that many incentives for building managers who run large buildings, especially low income or subsidized housing. They have to buy and they have to maintain the solar independently. So the question is, what is the alternative? What are we going to do? If our goal is renewable power, neither this centralized model nor the atomized model are really good ways of organizing our civic infrastructure. We need a different approach. And so with good energy, we've been imagining an alternative. It's something, I almost jokingly call an archipelago model, one with many little islands that are connected. So you can think of all those completely independent homes, the ones that have solar panels and batteries. And at any given moment, for example, you might want to run your microwave. But if it's cloudy out, you're only producing a little bit of power, so you end up buying power from the main grid. Now, imagine you and your neighbor share a battery. Your neighbor is at work and it was sunny earlier in the day. And so their house continues to be producing electricity, and you can draw on that common battery and use your microwave. So this is the basic principle of load balancing. You're leveling out the peaks and valleys of supply and demand. So when local production and consumption is bundled together at the scale of neighborhoods and communities, it's called a solar microgrid. This is a diagram of how a solar microgrid can be set up. There are a few different ways that this can work, but this is one that we're functionally working with. It's a group of 5 to 50 homes. It can include businesses or community buildings that have rooftop solar arrays, and they share a large battery. There's a software platform that brokers energy transactions between these buildings through the shared battery. And this platform is also optimizing for load balance, which makes the system as a whole more efficient for every producer and consumer. Microgrids can be cheaper than a neighborhood full of independent solar panel systems because they have a single grid utility hookup, and they can be financed and designed and installed all at one time. And I should mention this microgrid is connected to the main grid, which provides backup power when the neighborhood's consuming more than it's producing. But when the microgrid is producing net positive, it can also sell energy back to the main grid. So that means it's actually a revenue generating infrastructure in the long term. The microgrid can dump power onto the main grid when there's about to be peak demand, which is a kind of program they call virtual power plants. And a few different grid utilities in the United States are experimenting with that. It's a technique that can prevent brownouts, and it adds stability to the main grid. So over time, you've got more and more of these self-sufficient microgrids, and the main grid utility really just becomes a backup. And at that point, it's easier for power plants to predict when they need to be running, which is basically nights and peak weather events. And over time, you can use that stability as an opportunity to incrementally improve the main grid. You make incremental repairs instead of needing to replace the whole thing all at one time. So when the main grid does fail, these microgrids can go into island mode and they can be self-sufficient. So each home is getting a share of the total energy that's being produced, which can be enough for their essential or emergency loads. Best of all, these microgrids are possible. It's a technical infrastructure that we can build. It's doable. As an organizational model, it's a distributed and open system. And I think there's a realistic transition pathway from where we are today. So all of this sounds kind of too good to be true. And you're looking at me thinking like, why aren't there microgrids everywhere if they work so well and we can build them? The truth is that there are really significant obstacles. And those have to do a lot with the governance and the financing.
So we promised to talk about governance structure, not only physical ones. And this is where we run into problems. First, existing political systems don't do a good job of contemplating community-based infrastructures. In some places, a microgrid will be categorized as a utility. That means that a neighborhood will have to be certified and regulated the same way as a main utility provider is. In some cases, peer-to-peer energy transactions are a problem. Homes are classified as power plants and need to have power purchase contracts. That disqualifies residents from receiving federal renewable energy incentives. Or there are municipal regulations against having power lines that cross parcels lines. But the biggest challenge, though, are self-governance and financial modelings. First, getting a group of people to finance, own, and manage a shared assets is hard. Second, when organization combines social mission with commercial activities, they create an unfamiliar combination of activities for which a supportive ecosystem may not exist yet. So we have launched this venture called Good Energy because we believe that we can overcome these challenges. Our goal is to make resident-owned microgrids simple and accessible to all, no matter the income level of the community. That means we need to address both the physical and the organizational aspects of the civic infrastructure. On the technical side, we're building a Microsoft platform that tracks individual production and consumption. It brokers and optimizes energy transaction between homes. It decides when to store power, when to buy power, when to communicate with the main grid. The real innovation, though, is in the governance. So now we're going to talk about conventional versus steward ownership models. In a conventional ownership model, shareholder owns their assets and benefit from them. That means that they own the economic power, the ownership, the dividends, and the governance rights, the board seats, the votes, etc. The purpose and the mission is at the discretion then of the shareholders, and that may evolve with the rhythm of their changing priorities. At the contrary, in steward ownership models, the ownership of the assets can be differentiated from the governance rights. Our mission at Good Energy is to help those communities to set up a legal entity called Perpetual Purpose Trust that can be self-governed. This is kind of a community land trust. And the microgrid infrastructure can be owned in common by the neighbors or by third-party investors, while the asset is governed by the beneficiaries, in this case, the residents. Legally, the residents are trustees with a voting share, regardless of the financing solution that they opt to, which we will discuss in a second. As a group, they manage, therefore, this energy commons. A PTT, Power Perpetual Purpose Trust, has a fiduciary responsibility to steward social purpose. In this case, providing fairly priced, clean power and control over, the microgrid protocols to residents. So let's go back to the financing part of this maze. We're using a hybrid organizational model that aims to create both social value and commercial revenue. And this is a source of innovation. Hybrid structures are gaining traction. They allow social entrepreneurs to be less dependent on the nation. They allow founder and manager to not to have to choose between mission and profits. They are integrated in the same strategy. Profit generated according to this model can therefore be reinvested in the social mission, ultimately building large-scale solution to social problems. So how are we doing this in practice, really? With three structures. One, by creating a bridge between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Two, by offering attractive financing products to investors through a social investment fund. For example, we can offer return on investment on loans, tax incentive, carbon credits, renewable energy certificate, or green bonds. And third, by structuring a charitable giving vehicle to manage donation on behalf of philanthropist organizations, families, or individuals. While the services and solution offered by Good Energy is adaptable to any type of project, such a donation can specifically address the growing inequality and social gap between the different region and income classes as they play out in America's energy landscape today. So these are big challenge, but they're dream challenge for urban planners, legal innovator, and design thinker.
Absolutely. And we're really excited about what this means for energy systems specifically. We heard how crucial energy is to Middle America in talking about the Marshall Plan and how it's an important piece of climate transition in a place like Ontario. Things like good energy are realistically helping us shift toward renewable power. But I think the implications are actually much more broad than that. In our model, the community is capturing real and tangible value from a self-governed infrastructure. It's a resilient production and consumption unit. It's actually a revenue generating asset. And for those reasons, it's really immediately appealing on a sort of financial level. But at the same time, the shadow agenda here is that it's building these relational structures for self-governance. It's fostering long-term trust among a community. And we heard Grant talk earlier about human behavior change and these hard household decisions that we all make on a day-to-day basis. And the good news is that those get easier over time. The more of these decisions you're making and the more you're building trust in the community, the easier it is to continue doing that. And so I believe that we're ushering in a new way of organizing cities and civic infrastructures and access to critical resources. So this same kind of archipelago organization model, I think, can be used in other domains. And there are some examples of doing that already. There are community groups in Toronto and New York that are taking a similar approach to setting up high quality, community-owned broadband mesh networks for internet access. You can imagine food being produced and consumed in this kind of local archipelago way. There could be peer-to-peer vehicle sharing networks within neighborhoods that are connected by interregional systems, and the list goes on. So I think this archipelago model is a way of organizing civic infrastructure that's enabling distributed control and open scale. Some of the mechanisms that we're creating, the financial and legal and governance protocols that we're creating, can actually be applied to these other systems. And this can create local efficiencies, and overall, it can be a generative system and not an extractive one from an ecological standpoint. So we think that we're on the edge of a revolution in how cities are organized, and we're imagining these distributed open systems for building and governing urban infrastructures. We believe they're sustainable. We believe they can be vital and that they can create shared local value. Diane, if you have anything to add, please do. If not, that's where we're wrapping up.
Nothing to add. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Diane and Matthew, for that. I learned a lot about legal frameworks for utility provision there. I will give everybody a moment to put their questions in the chat box. And in the meantime, I wonder, while we're just coming off the back of that presentation, if you could, have you tested your model yet? And if so, could you tell us a little bit about how the pilot went? And if not, you've already mentioned, some examples in New York and Toronto of, examples of community-led organization. So I wonder if you could tell us some more about other examples.
Sure. We're in the midst of setting up a pilot project right now in the Portland area. And that's together with solar installer. We're talking to grid utilities. So it's very much in the works. We're building the plane as we're flying it. And we're working together with the Purpose Foundation, which is a kind of think tank that helps with alternative ownership models here in the United States. And they're really terrific. There are examples of community-owned energy systems. There are cooperative grid utilities in states across the United States. Diane mentioned land trusts, which are similar. So there are a lot of pieces, and we're sort of duct taping them together with solar technology and offering a solution that we think can work at a neighborhood level.
Yeah, it has been used in different type of industries, or we have found models with either focus on the perpetual purpose trust and governance structure versus the community. So as mentioned by Matthew, we're putting all these pieces together.
I see that Chris has noted this sounds similar to the solar and battery tech highlighted in the movie 2040. Well, moving on, actually, I'll ask a question to the group because it was, oh, here we go. We've got a question from Yoon Sim. Can this model work with other renewable energy types such as wind?
So I think that with wind, you wouldn't have, specifically a wind structure on your rooftop, for example, or in your garden, but you could scale down the current alien structure that we know and apply the solution to wind too. But I think that you will have to scale it down.
I think typically, if you're interested in supporting wind as an individual, some grid utilities offer the opportunity to pay a little bit more on your utility bill, and they purchase a proportionally greater degree of their power from wind farms, simply because wind is only really efficient at the scale of giant turbines that exist on giant wind farms in other parts of the world, not in dense downtown areas. And so I think this is a great question. I think it would be interesting to transpose our model to other domains. I think wind has fewer use cases in the kind of neighborhood community scale where you would want to own the asset.
I have a question for the wider group because it was another theme that came up in all three of the presentations was around trust. And so I wonder if you can all think about and tell me about how, if you've been able to build trust to the level of being able to not only share successes with the people that you're collaborating with, but also the failures and what that means for learning together. Have you been able to open space for conversation around past failures as an entry point for moving forward and fostering social innovation? And feel free to hop in whenever you want to, for anybody who has when you're ready.
Not to put anyone on the spot, but literally to audibly to tee up Lydia. This sounds like something that I'm sure that Connect has run into, just past histories or past relationships to work through. So Lydia, I don't know if you have anything on that point to frame in? As far as building trust when you might be coming in when trust has eroded in the past?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get super into like saying where there isn't trust right now, but I will say
like how to work through it.
but yeah. So I think, I mean, honestly, it's just like any relationship. And I think that's something that every discipline should teach more of is like relational health, communication, and like the awareness of self when you're talking to others. Especially, I think sometimes we get a little bit out of that when we leave campus and go into the community. It's funny, I was on another conference earlier today where we talked about how there are some communities that really don't trust academics coming into their community to say, hey, we've got solutions for you that you didn't ask for. But I will say, I think it's not so much a failure. I think that the failure is the expectation that things can happen as fast as you want them to. I think the expectation that people can change their minds as fast as you want them to, because I feel like I've watched light bulbs in the last 3 years go over, various municipal and elected appointed officials' heads, and all of a sudden they're on board. But, a week before, I would have thought they would never get on board because it just, they hadn't had enough time with it yet. And the thing that made that light bulb go off hadn't happened yet. And so I think what I would like to stress around that trust is the time. You have to invest more time to build it than I think we tend to do, especially when we're coming into places saying, what you're doing is really wrong. You're killing everybody. Change what you're doing, So I guess that's my point, is the time.
Sorry, Julius, you about to talk?
No, go ahead. I'll go after.
Well, I'll be brief. I think I'll try to be brief. I think that I agree with Lydia, and others probably have a similar experience, that academics are often not the first to be trusted, and that's for good reason. I think I received some science communication training that I thought was really helpful, and part of that training involved going to give a lecture on climate change and opportunities in coal country here, and it was a very challenging exercise, but it was really worthwhile. And I also think, I talked to Lydia and Grant about this as well, we don't do a good enough job as academics sort of talking through projects that didn't go as well as they could have, or matches that we wanted to make on a proposal, but we couldn't make because we couldn't find a good fit. And so I think there's really a good opportunity for us as academic institutions to connect with our partners and have a lessons learned type of event. And part of that, I think, is also just, we don't do a great job of pulling up our municipal partners at times and saying, like, look, we did a project together, but academics have a tendency to want to take all the credit. And often we have really, great thought leaders in our local government community. So I think that a little humility is deserved in the academics circles. And I found that just being a better communicator, trying to be very relevant to the audience is really a key thing, making sure that what you're talking about resonates with them. We heard from Julius today about the importance of doing that, and taking the time to have lessons learned, not just in terms of failed trust, but just why did this not fit well? Why wasn't this a good match is also a good thing to do.
I was just going to add that in our case, part of that trust was showing up. We had a number of people in our community who really wanted to take action and were doing it sort of on their own. We had a couple of people who literally took years off of work to focus their action on climate change. So just showing up and supporting them in what they were going to do. And I think even in the project that I talked about today, like, we showed up with the money and the consultant and was like, go have at it. And I think people really appreciated that, because like, we were providing them with the resources that they never would have come up with themselves, in it with an eye to supporting the work that they wanted to do. Our community, we had some federal government grants here that were focused at community organizations, and they applied to some of those to build some sort of climate change resource center within our community. So like part of this was like, if you guys get the resource center, you can use this tool and this information in the resource center. So like, you know, we showed up for them, we provided them with resources. That was a sort of a key part of building that trust. And you know, the cities don't often always show up for the community, which is kind of an oxymoron, but continually doing that built that trust. So even in times when we had challenges with our council, or we had challenges with others, or we just had, you know, hiccups in our process, the community was like, we know you guys are working hard, we know you're trying, we know you're doing the best you can. You know, we'll support you, or we'll hang on while you figure out what you need to figure out. And I think that was a big part of what we did through that process.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm wondering actually in both cases, in the development of the Marshall Plan and in your work in Richmond Hill, who have been the biggest champions and who have been biggest detractors, and how do you foster that conversation? I mean, I'm really interested in some of the strategies, Julius, that you mentioned about this local nuance of a place, and talking about, you know, that lake that everyone loves to go to. Well, here's what's going to happen to it in 50 years. And so I'm really interested in those kind of rhetorical devices. Michael, you mentioned, as you know, really learning how to communicate effectively and having an awareness of yourself and a humility. So I'm just generally curious about that, if either of you can comment more.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is born a bit from my experience as somebody who's worked at the city level addressing climate change, and just generally like being in the climate movement, that, you know, the first picture you see is always of that polar bear on the melting iceberg. And there are a lot of people, and, you know, coming from my family is immigrants to Canada. I'm born here, but my parents are immigrants to Canada. Like, that polar bear picture means nothing to them, right? And you know, so, you know, in engagement, we often talk about, like, you know, we need to meet people where they are. And that usually means like go to the mall, or go to the community center, or go to the farmer's market. But I think of that phrase as like, we need to meet people where they are in terms of their knowledge, in terms of the way they think. You know, I often talk about, like, I've worked for cities for the past almost 10 years. As a citizen of, I live in Toronto, even though I work in Richmond Hill. As a citizen of Toronto, I've never gone to a public meeting. I've never gone to a council meeting. I've never engaged in the public process. And part of that is like, I have a job, I have a son, I have a wife, I have a family. Like, you know, I just don't have the time. So part of it is meeting people where they are in terms of where they're going. But part of it is meeting people where they are in terms of their knowledge. And for many people, their context is, you know, the street that they drive down, or, you know, their kid's school, or, you know, when I worked in another city, and we used to talk about the fact that we had a major, I don't know if you guys would have heard about it, we had a major flood in Toronto a number of years ago. And, you know, there was one guy who lived in his backyard literally for 3 months because his basement was flooded out. There was another school that it flooded 3 feet in 30 minutes. Luckily, it was July, so there was no kids in the school, but you can imagine what that would have been like. And the school's emergency plan was to walk over the bridge that went over the creek to the other school that was in the floodplain. Like, that was their emergency plan. So like, when we think about the local context and the local mindset of folks, connecting that to their day-to-day lives is going to connect them to the climate action. I often think of climate change, I was saying this to somebody at work, climate change is a social issue that has environmental impacts. It's not necessarily, I don't think about it as an environmental issue. And when we think about that, we think about how we move through our day. We think about how we relate to our cities and to others within our city. The way we address climate change becomes a very different conversation, and I think a very crucial one. But we don't often think about that way. Like the work that you're doing, Matthew, with microgrids, like that all has to do with, you know, how do we engage with the power grid? How do we engage with our neighbors? How do we transact in terms of our cars and our houses? And, you know, that becomes a social issue and not necessarily an infrastructure issue, or becomes as much a social issue as it does an infrastructure issue. And I think, thinking more about meeting people where they are, thinking more about how climate change impacts us here is going to get at some of those people who, they don't care about the polar bears. Our plan, and many of the plans that I've been involved in, have an economic development aspect to it, because it's like, how are we creating jobs in our community? How are we giving money to people in our community? How are we raising the less fortunate in our community? All of those things that we think about, again, hyper local, and are about people in their community and their cities and what they think about on a day-to-day basis. It's not about like, we need to save the polar bear, that's iceberg is melting. That is a very valid message, but that doesn't resonate with a lot of people in our society. And I think understanding, when you put your bin on the driveway, and your driveway, what actually happens to that bin is going to help somebody when they put something in that bin think about, oh, this is what actually happens with this. I need to take action, as opposed to you need to put the proper things in the bin because you're going to save that polar bear. Like, it becomes a very different conversation, and it engages people in a different way. And there's people who are not being engaged, and I feel like that's how you engage them.
Julius, that was wonderfully said. That's, I think, the perfect way to end the session, and tying it actually back to the sessions more broadly across the conference. A big surprise from the organizers' perspective is that, even though this is a science and innovation-based conference, we've sort of heard a recurring theme that it's not the science that's going to shift the dial for ameliorating the climate change impacts that are happening. It's recognition of like the culture and the social changes that need to occur, and also seeing how heritage and history kind of come together to inform what steps we'll take next. So with that, I would really want to thank all of you for coming today. It was an excellent presentation across all three. It's been a real pleasure to moderate this, and wish you all the best and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
That's all.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.